ladies and gentlemen, welcome tonight to Holding Redlich here in Brisbane CBD. My name is Paul Lucas. I'm the President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs Queensland branch, and I'd another great evening tonight, straight after our AGM, where as usual, not a lot happened, but great to have you all here where a whole lot's going to happen very shortly. Our wonderful speaker is Dr. Faiza El-Higzi OAM, and I'll have my fellow councillor Colin Forrest both introduce Faiza and moderate the speech, the talk, and there will be an opportunity for questions. Can I first, though, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, the Yagara and the Turrbal people of the Bay, as well the Pondamuka people, and acknowledge the continued association with and custodianship of the land, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. We're getting towards the end of the year now at AIIA Queensland, but we continue to deliver quality discussions and debate and information, and this evening tonight is no exception. So I'll now hand over to Colin, and we're looking forward to hearing from Faiza. Colin.
Thank you, Paul. It's great that we're going to have a conversation tonight about what some people have called the forgotten war. With so many wars, or at least two big ones, going on in the world at the moment, they seem to be sucking up all the oxygen. That is the war in the Middle East, or the wars, or whatever you want to call them, and the war in Ukraine. But the war in Sudan has been going on for even longer, although it's hard to say that the war in the Middle East hasn't been going on for a long time, isn't it? But the war in Sudan has been going on for a long time without much world attention. So it's terrific that we have a great speaker here tonight who's going to at least focus our attention on it. And I'd like to just introduce our speaker to you. Dr. Faiza El-Higzi OAM, as Paul already told you, is a political scientist and a social advocate. She has amazing qualifications across a number of fields. She has academic qualifications in architecture, management, international business, education, and gender studies. What an array of qualifications that is. She's worked in the public, private, and NGO sectors, in strategic policy, community development, refugee settlement, and youth engagement. She is now an advisor to the Queensland Government on domestic and family violence, multiculturalism, and health equity. Dr. El-Higzi has recently turned her attention to academia and is now focusing on scholarly contributions at the University of Queensland. We welcome you here tonight and thank you very much for coming along and giving us this great insight into something that we should know a lot more about.
Thank you all very much, and it's good to be here and see some of the faces who are familiar. And just had your AGM, so congratulations to the returning officers. I hear there were no changes. That's great. Stability is fantastic because we're going to talk about instability at the political level. So, as you heard, my name is Faiza, and I was born in Sudan. I lived almost half of my life in Sudan, and the second half of my life here in Australia. So now I think balance of it's 50-50. You know? Half of my life in Sudan and half here. But all my life in Sudan has been in Khartoum, which is the center. And Sudan was all the way up to here. And because it's been in war for a long time, you know, south of Sudan has been in war, or there has been a civil war in Sudan for quite a long time. There was a cessation. In 2010, North and South separated from each other. So Sudan now, for me who grew up with Sudan having a tail, it's still difficult to see it chopped. It still looks a different country, and it is indeed a different country. So I'm just going to see if this works or not.
That's the example.
So this is a WhatsApp message that my sister sent to me on the 29th of August. The war started on the 15th of April. And until that day, and until today, she is housebound. And that is not a choice, but a necessity. Because with this civil war, there is gender violence, and there is the possibility that anyone who leaves their house might not return. And so she is in her late 60s, has lived all her life in Sudan, has been a general practitioner, and has served in regional areas as a community medicine doctor, helping women with maternity issues and women's business and children and so on. And a few years ago, she and her husband, who's also a gynecologist, decided to retire and just enjoy the rest of their days. Now they are both housebound. They have lost everything they have. They have 3 children. One of them is a daughter. Their daughter has not seen the front gate of the house since that day. Because the worry is that if she even opens the window in her room and she is sighted by one of the militiamen, that could be the end of the whole family. My sister talks about a time around a month from that date where the militias had taken over Khartoum city. She lives in Khartoum North, which is like, Logan City. And they were just going house to house, entering, looting, pillaging. And so a lot of people abandoned their homes, fled. But she and her husband and her children, who are young adults, decided to stay because her husband has had an operation on his back. And any movement, jumping in a car and traveling on rough terrain might render him paralyzed. So they decided to stay. And because they live in a leafy suburb, and the majority, almost 95% of the houses around their neighborhood have been evacuated. People fled. The militia were going house to house, entering and pillaging. And so they came to their house. They didn't know people were there. They rammed the door and went inside and were surprised that there was a family. And so they accused them of being spies to the government and had the guns pointed to her sons. And while that was happening, they were searching the house for signs that these people are spies. They even opened the water tank to look inside. They're hiding any equipment or communication. And when they found nothing, they weren't sure what to do. Should we kill them, take over the house? Should we take the women with us, kill the men? And so my sister, once she realized this is what they're thinking about, she started screaming and fainting. And as she was screaming, she was like talking in Arabic. And the head of that group of militia who entered the house was from an Arab tribe. And so he told his men, we will not touch this family because they are from the same tribe that I come from. And that was what saved them. So this is the situation in Sudan. How do they live? The children have not been able to work since that day. They have used all their savings. And now they rely on us, their family members who are outside of the country. We send them money every now and again just to help them survive, food and drink, nothing more than that. There are no aspirations anymore. It's just the basic necessities. The situation is such that if you drive your car and one of the militiamen in areas occupied by the militia likes the car, they will stop you and they will ask you to leave the car. If you don't, they will shoot you, throw you out, and take the car. So nobody drives cars anymore. Their car is hidden in the house, and her eldest son, who's around 30-something, is the only one that leaves the house. And whenever he is going to buy food, they say goodbye to each other. He walks for something like 10 kilometers just to get to the nearest market that's still working, to buy food, and then walk for another 3 hours. So he leaves in the morning, he comes around sunset, and during that time, they don't know if he's alive or not, because he could be killed by anyone. Militiamen are walking down the roads in Khartoum city, brandishing their Kalashnikovs, and they can do what they want to whomever they want. There is no accountability, and it's a state of fear. Somebody said that even in Gaza, there are boundaries. Like, you still see the people having a semblance of life. But in Sudan, their international conventions do not exist. Each group of the militia have their own rules. There is no central communication where, a head would tell the others, these are the boundaries. Hospitals have been bombed, schools have been bombed, and people die on a daily basis. It's a very dire situation. I put this because in 2019, I did a session here at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And in 2019, we had an uprising, a civilian uprising. It was called the Arab Spring, the fourth wave of the Arab Spring. It was so positive that people all over the world were talking about it. It was a non-violent movement that toppled a 30-year dictatorship. People were jubilant. They brought in a democratic government. And so I came and I did a presentation, and amidst all that jubilation, I was not optimistic. I wish I was, because I said that in Sudan there is a history of failure of democracy, and that there are deep fault lines and regional and international interests. And it's these different interests that feed the war that is happening in Sudan. It's not just, a civil war. It's almost a proxy war, and some people call it interest war. So what did we talk about in 2019, almost 5 years ago? The political stability in Sudan, conflict, whether it's in the north and the south, because Sudan is ethnically diverse, and there has never been a policy of ethnic diversity. So groups lived in their own regional areas, and development was in the center, with no economic development, or cultural or social development in the peripheral areas. And the people who lived in the center were people like me, of Arabic origin. And so that created tensions between people who belonged to different African groups and the Arabs in the middle. It created that tension, It led to the cessation of the south of Sudan from the north of Sudan. And then there was the Darfur ethnic cleansing. We're all aware of what happened there. And that is also part of what's happening now. There is a second wave of ethnic cleansing. And as I said, the political interests in Sudan are influenced by regional interests and by interventions. So Sudan gained its independence in 1956, same time as Singapore. Just for comparison. Since then, it only had 13 years of democratic rule. It's probably 12 years. I was a bit generous and added, the year that was a toppling of the council there. 64 years of military rule. So the history of democratic governance is not one that Sudan is comfortable with. And so gained independence in 1956. 3 years later, there was a coup and the chief of the military took control of the country. He stayed for 7 years, was toppled by a civilian uprising, non-violent civilian uprising. That went on for a few years. In 1986, again, we had so from 1965 until that was the longest period that we had democratic government until 1969, 4 years. Until 69, we had democratic government, same trend, toppled over by the chief of the military, who stayed for 15 years. Civilian uprising, 3-4 years of democratic government, toppled over by Omar al-Bashir, who stayed for 30 years. When I look at the trend, multiply by 2, so I'm not really optimistic about what's happening now. If you just look at the trend of what's going on. So what happened after Omar al-Bashir, the 30-year dictator, was toppled in December 2019? Let me just check it. Yeah. So there were negotiations on the 5th. There was military civilian government sharing, because people thought like it's always a toppling, so let's bring everyone together this time and see how it goes. If you just go civilian, you'll get toppled in 3 years. Let's start together and see how it goes. So they had a power sharing with the military, because the military sided with the non-violent civilian uprising in December. And so these are the two individuals. This is Hemeti, who is the paramilitary leader, and this is Borhan, who is the chief of the military, and this is Hamdouk, who is the civilian prime minister at the time. The idea was that this council, the Transitional Military Council, would lead the country for 3 years, write a new constitution, set up the Electoral Commission, and then take the country towards a new dawn of democracy, where the military is at the decision-making table rather than being sidelined. Just shy of 9 months before the transition to a democratic government, this guy here decided that I'm enjoying power too much, not going to let this happen. And so he detained the prime minister in his house and disbanded the Transitional Military Council. A coup is in a coup. And so to bring this guy with him, the two of them decided to sit on the Transitional Military Council without a civilian government. That was in November 2021, where the elections were supposed to happen around July of 2022. So it continued for a year, and on April 2023, Hemeti decided, why should I share power with, the military? I can do this on my own. Hemeti has history. So he belongs to let me see if I've got a map. Yep. So, yeah. It's gonna jump around. So Hemeti comes from tribes in this area. So this is Sudan, this is South Sudan, the Red Sea is here, Egypt, Libya, Chad, Kenya, and so on. So he belongs to tribes that has links traditionally with Chad. His mother is from a Chadian tribe, so he's half Chad, half Chadian, half Sudanese. And he was respected in his own community. And so at some point, the Sudan became a thoroughfare. Once the Libyan Gaddafi government was toppled, the border with the Mediterranean became very soft. And we started seeing movements of people migrating to Europe. It became very difficult to close that border with the Mediterranean. So what the European Union did was to, close this space. If the movement of people from this area, Eritrea, Ethiopia, because there is a lot of conflict happening here, this movement of people, if it can be stopped here, then they don't have to worry about further there. So they funded Hemeti to intercept people trafficking over here. And a big camp was set up here, which builds on what happened afterward. So this guy suddenly found himself with lots of European money. He was given the opportunity of arming his own militias. So it became, paramilitary group within the government. This happened with the blessing of the dictator of the time, who was worried about his own power, and so felt that, I have someone here who's my ally, who can jump in and support me militarily, then I'm in good hands. No one can topple me. So there was interest both ways. It helped the dictator of the time, it helped the European Union. So when Hemeti found himself with military capacity, he started attacking the people in the Darfur region. And that's when the massacres started happening, the Janjaweed massacres. So he started having his own ambition and attacked the tribes there and almost captured or conquered those areas. And this has happened again now, the area of Rojimena. So it's very multi-layered. And while I'm talking about this, I'll also talk about the global interest in this space. Just go back. So yes, these are the two warring leaders. So different colors. Started last year, 14, 15 months. The purple are the areas occupied by the paramilitary groups. And the occupation is not a peaceful one. It's proper war going pillage, kill, conquer, capture, and the reputation is such that once people hear that they are in the next city, people start fleeing because they burn houses, they rape, and so on. And these are the areas that are in, government occupied. So people are asking, like, you had a military, but the military wasn't really strong enough to defend the people of Sudan. The civilians in Sudan have not been defended. And because of that conflict, the yellow line, the yellow color, these are other groups who started also occupying areas, pillaging, engaging in the war. So it's a state of lawlessness. Khartoum used to be the city center. So it's Khartoum, Khartoum North, and Omdurman. The government, because this is now occupied by the paramilitary, the government is now, which is the military, because there is no civilian government, is operating out of Port Sudan. And Port Sudan is a port city. It doesn't have the governance infrastructure, but there is a semblance of a government there. So the problem with all what's happening is Sudan, before the war, relied on humanitarian aid because it's gone through drought, it's gone through civil war, it's gone through corrupt government, and so on. It was relying on aid. And so now the aid routes were coming from Chad and from Port Sudan. The problem is with opening of the aid routes, especially in this area, because Hemeti has got interest in this area and has got presence. The paramilitary groups started receiving further ammunition and supplies, further arms supplies. So the theory tells us that in situations like this, where the conflict is about two people vying for power, they will continue fighting until they don't have energy. And energy here is about supplies. And as long as they are receiving supplies, the war will continue. And so they were receiving, instead of humanitarian aid, they were receiving ammunition. And so the government realized that and stopped humanitarian aid entering the country. So it's been probably since November last year, there hasn't been any humanitarian aid entering the country. And so now the percentages of people who are, starvation and so on. Can you see that? Yeah, so these are the numbers we're talking about. Let's see. 10 million plus people displaced. That is in total. 2.3 million have fled to other countries, mainly, up north to Egypt, some to Chad, some to South Sudan. And South Sudan is problematic because it's also going through its own issues. As a country, it's a young country that's just, came to life 14 years ago. And so it cannot maintain millions of people coming to it. And the rest internally displaced 8.1 million. So I've got also a brother in Sudan who decided to leave his house because where he was living, the paramilitary groups were using live ammunition on a daily basis, targeting airplanes and so on. So he was quite worried. And at some point, he was standing next to the window and just a bullet came, broke the window and got stuck on the wall. So if he had just taken a step, he would have gone. So he decided that, no way. He took his kids and moved to moved to Al Jazeera, which is like maybe something, say, two. At the time, Al Jazeera was not occupied, but now Al Jazeera is occupied. And so they live, again, a very precarious life. So the number of people, this is considered the largest humanitarian displacement. Even though we've got a war in Ukraine, even though we've got a war in the Middle East, the number of people displaced in Sudan is by far the largest internally and externally. Impact on education. So my brother has got 2 young children, primary school children. The last time they went to school was on the 23rd of April, 2023. So these are primary school children who have lost 2 years of education that they will never get back because all schools have closed, teachers have fled the country, schools are used by the paramilitary groups to congregate, to plan, and so on. So there are no children in Sudan who are now going to school, have been to school since that day. 70% of the health infrastructure has been targeted. And so you've got a health crisis, an education crisis. The universities have not opened since that time, and a food crisis. So in terms of a humanitarian crisis, Sudan is at a very, very low area where I don't think it has ever gone through a situation like that, even though it had civil war previously and different ways of democratic governance and dictatorship. It has never been in a place like this. So these are just, some of the data, and this was 23rd of September, just a couple of weeks ago. This was the data collected just a couple of weeks ago. So half of Sudan's population is in need of humanitarian assistance, 24.8 million people. What's the population of Australia?
27 million.
26. So imagine all of us here in Australia are in need of humanitarian assistance, food insecurity, education insecurity, just this is a sad, and I do apologize. Every time I come here, I tell a sad story, so my apologies about that. I've got some videos, but these videos are really, I've got violence, so I'm not going to play them. Ethnic cleansing allegations in El Geneina, which is, the west of the country bordering Chad. Again, this is the space that the Janjaweed Hemeti, a few years ago, has done ethnic cleansing. It's happened again. When no one's looking, it has happened again. And there is footage of people just running, leaving their homes and being killed. Allegations of rape by both the paramilitary group and by the military as well are widespread. So there are no boundaries. It's become very, very problematic. And that's why, my sister and her daughter do not leave the house. So yes, the conflict is still active, and even it touches us even here in Australia. And I think over the last months, I probably went to every week. I'd probably be visiting one of the Sudanese families here to offer my condolences because they've lost someone in Sudan. Just a month ago, one of the women here said that her sister, her husband, and their son died because of skirmishes between the paramilitary and the government. So the government now uses drones to target the homes where the paramilitary groups are staying. And they assume that the house that this woman was staying was occupied by the paramilitary group, and so it was bombed by drone. So these are very common stories that we hear here in Australia. Some of the stories are about people in the 60s, in the 70s, like my sister, who thought that they're going to have, a peaceful older age, feeling so frustrated that they have heart attacks or they have high blood pressure and die. So these are mainly the two causes. Whenever we hear someone has died, it's either because they had a heart attack, they couldn't take it anymore, or they have been killed by a fire, either from the paramilitary or from the military itself. So it's really, really becoming very problematic. Prior to getting in this situation, all humanitarian organizations in Sudan were evicted. The last days of the previous dictatorship, Omar al-Bashir, he evicted all of them. And so there is no infrastructure for international humanitarian aid organizations in Sudan. And so the distribution of humanitarian aid is reliant on community organizations, small-scale community organizations that are local, distributing the aid. But the stories that are emerging now is that both the paramilitary group and the military are also pillaging the humanitarian aid. So whenever they see a shipment coming, they just go in and take it, and no one can say anything. And so it's just it's becoming really, really difficult. Logistical difficulties about the humanitarian aid. Where does it come from? For any shipment to come, it needs the government in Port Sudan to approve it so that it can get into the country, and the logistics are very difficult. Government sometimes does not approve, no reason, nobody knows why. Sometimes approves it, and when it approves it, it takes it because it assumes that if it goes, then the paramilitary group will take it, and so it might as well just use it themselves. We talked about food insecurity, the displacement that is happening, and then the health impact. So now people are starting to talk about an outbreak of cholera in Sudan. I think last week there was a report of the first polio case in Sudan. We have not had a polio case in Sudan for 60 years. So all these diseases are starting to show again because the health infrastructure has been decimated. So on top of all that's happening, other things, there is economic decline, and that started happening when the transitional military council was there. Just the lack of knowledge, because there has been a 30-year of dictatorship. You don't get a strong public sector. And when you don't have a strong public sector, you don't have a strong policy knowledge. And so when the Transitional Military Council came into being, they could not find the brains, the skills, and the knowledge to start creating new ideas, developing policies of development and so on. they started bringing in people like me who live overseas and are knowledgeable about policies that work in democracies and in industrialized countries. So some of these people went back to Sudan and started implementing, in good faith, probably the wrong policies, which exacerbated the economic situation of the country. And so it was spiraling. Then you get COVID coming in the middle of that, disrupting everything. And it was just quite problematic. Cost of living, people talking about hyperinflation, but also the social fabric. Sudan was one of those countries where the social fabric was so tightly knit. People who've lived in Sudan always talk about how generous and kind the people of Sudan are, even though it was one of the poorest countries in the world. People were known for their generosity, their kindness, and their interdependence. But the situations, the ongoing situation, disrupted that social fabric, and because people could no longer feed their own families, it became very, very difficult for them to look after others as well. We talked about children. 19 million children are displaced and out of school. The health impact, we talk about women in particular, are victims of war because of maternal health, general hygiene and health, and the gender violence that happens to women and girls in situations like that. We talked about gender-based violence. So there are checkpoints, harassment checkpoints. We talked about, abduction, sexual assault by both parties. And with the paramilitary group, there is the systematic rape of women. And that is something that they have used in the ethnic cleansing in Darfur. It's in their DNA.
So we can have some questions.
Sure. So you probably have questions about this one. All this doom and gloom. What is the international community have to need? We started by saying the world has forgotten about Sudan. The world has probably forgotten about Sudan because there are two processes. One, the African Union is trying to address the political conflict between the two heads, Hemeti and Burhan. And then there is Saudi Arabia, who is trying to just call for a ceasefire and humanitarian aid access. And none of them has been able to do anything for the last 15 months, even though there has been a number of efforts in that regard. So I'll leave it there and we'll open it for questions.
As is usual, the moderator gets to ask the first question. So I've got one.
Sure.
I'm wondering if either of the two opposing sides are being backed by international players.
Absolutely. People call it a war of interests because, let me see, I've got a slide here. So the paramilitary group are backed by Russia and by the United Arab Emirates. Russia, the Wagner group, because the Wagner group is not really interested in Sudan. They are interested in the gold mines that Hemeti has access to because he conquers, or he has conquered that area, which is the west of Sudan, which is very rich in resources and in gold in particular. The United Arab Emirates is also interested in the gold, and so they are backing up the paramilitary group, and it's known that both groups are providing ammunition to the paramilitary group. The government, the military is backed by Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Egypt, of course, is worried because it's the northern neighbor. Is worried that any disruption in Sudan through the paramilitary group will find its way and disrupt democracy. And so they want stability. And because of the River Nile, water is very important for Egypt. And so anything can disrupt access to water or instability. The Egyptians are not interested in that. And Saudi Arabia wants to play the role of the arbitrator in the Middle East. They want to set themselves a space where they are the respected elder of the Middle East. They're trying to play that, and they've called for a number of peace negotiations in Jeddah and in Manama, but nothing came out of that. There is a third player, Ukraine. Yep. So Ukraine is looking at ways of hurting Russia, and so Ukrainians are training the military of Sudan on the use of drones. So it's become a proxy war for regional and international, interest, and so it's very difficult to detangle all of those threats and just end up with the two. So the idea now is it has to be pressure from these interests that will force these two heads or these two warring parties to sit down and talk. The Geneva process did not succeed because only one of them went to Switzerland for the discussions and the other party decided not to go.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Diana?
Yes, Diana Lopes, Honorary Consul for Portugal. I was just wondering what connection, if any, is there to the other forgotten war in Yemen?
Look, absolutely. I mean, the war in Yemen has been going on for such a long time. Again, similar interests in Yemen. The different parties, so Saudi Arabia and the UAE are part of the war in Yemen. And they are opposing each other. And that's one of the reasons why it has bled into Sudan. Because Sudan was supporting the paramilitary group in Sudan was sending militias paid for by the UAE to fight in Yemen. Mm-hmm. And that strengthened that link with each other. And so the two are connected in the sense that the tension between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is playing in Yemen. And as long as the international community is not intervening there and intervening here, because it's the same parties to the conflict, they will be forgotten.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Guillaume. I'm from South Sudan. I would like to ask a question.
Sure.
Because the war in Sudan is like a war among the Arab tribes themselves, as opposed to the war in South Sudan and the Sudan, or the civil war that was there before the secession of South Sudan. Is there any hidden objective from maybe the paramilitary group, other than the power struggle between the two leaders? Are there things to correct, like past injustice? I know some complaints from Western Sudan are being marginalized by the center.
Absolutely.
Is that playing there?
Look, that could have played at the beginning, because you're absolutely right. The problem with South Sudan, the west of Sudan, the tribes of the paramilitary group, was that the development and the focus and everything was in the middle of the country, where it was predominantly the Arab groups. Everybody on the periphery was forgotten. So it was center versus periphery. And with the cessation of the south of Sudan, people on the west started talking about cessation as well. They wanted to separate. So there was a movement about separating the west of Sudan from the rest of the country. But the problem is that the middle of Sudan has no resources. So it used to rely on the oil resources of the south and on the agricultural and gold resources of the west. And so there was a strong desire to quash any talk about the West separating from the rest of the country, because then you've got nothing left there. So are there injustices? Of course, there are injustices about development, but also about racism. It's the south of Sudan, there was racism. People were treated as second-class citizens in the middle of the country, in Khartoum and other areas. And it's the same with people from the west of Sudan. And even here, these ideas travel even here. So groups from the west of Sudan socialize separately from the groups of the north of Sudan. Yeah, so that there are injustices there, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think there was a question.
Is there an online question?
It's actually just been answered. You asked that question.
It's just been
yourself.
answered?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Yes,
All right. David, you had a question.
Yeah, hi, Faiza. Yeah, is one side getting on top of the other, or is this just a stalemate that's capable of going on for a long, long time?
It's a stalemate. Like if you go back to the map. Sorry, I'm going. If you go back to the map of occupation, it's a stalemate. This week we heard, yeah, so it's almost, the big space is Khartoum in the middle of the country here. That's the center. This one and this one are the two important areas. This one's now, so, different colors, balance is happening there. The idea is that this group will start taking the rest, but there is a lot of opposition, and the US has started to become engaged, and that is putting pressure on the regional allies, whether it's Saudi Arabia or whether it's the UAE. There is a degree of pressure because of the destabilization of the region. In Africa, when something happens, there is almost a domino effect in countries in the region. So there is a worry now that there is so much going in the Middle East that this would spiral out of control. And so the US, just in August, starting paying attention back and really coming in. And they do have weight because they were involved in the discussions about the cessation of the south of Sudan, and actually put great effort into that happening, because the north of Sudan did not want that split to take place.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having the speech. You were talking about how they brought overseas educated people to come help out with the government, but you said they were misguided. So what was misguided, and what went wrong with the policies they implemented?
Yeah, so you're talking about policies that are used in industrialized developed nations, transferred to underdeveloped countries. Very different context. You cannot look at the manufacturing strategy of Australia and superimpose that in a country like Sudan that has gone through dictatorship and so on, because the way policies are developed here is through a process of consultation with people and so on. That did not happen and could not happen because people didn't know what they wanted. They had no understanding of the processes of policy development. So people came with ideas and started putting those ideas. So one of the things was floating the Sudanese pound. And that created havoc in a country that was not producing to the best of its capacity to start linking the Sudanese pound to the green pound. That meant on a daily basis, there were fluctuations. The money I get today as part of my salary will mean nothing. And so instead of having some protectionist strategies to help the country, get up on its feet economically, build its infrastructure, its education system, get it to a level where it can be competitive, ideas that were used in developed countries were brought in, and that destabilized the system.
We're just about done. Okay, one more question?
Yeah, I may
Make it a very quick one. We haven't got very long left. No?
sorry, just Raphael from a women community. Just asking on the side of the military, the way you are describing like the cruelty, like the killings and the massacres, is the paramilitary trying to help or protect the people?
It's the paramilitary that's engaging in genocide. Yep. Yeah, it's the paramilitary that's going into cities and taking them over and killing people. The military is trying to protect, but they're doing that through aerial bombardment, which is falling on people's homes. So civil society is in the middle of a war run by two armed parties.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the quick answer. Are you going to talk about? Okay, I'll hand it over to Grant Kerridge.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you enormously, Dr. Faiza, for giving that talk that really displays clearly the role of a group like AAA of informing Australians about many events in international affairs that often get limited airways in Australia. So thank you enormously for that very informative talk. We have a number of very interesting talks coming up. Firstly, on Thursday this week, we've got a members-only event on the human rights situation in Burundi, challenges and opportunities, and that's for members only, as I said, with Her Excellency Imelda Sebushimiki, who is the Minister for National Solidarity, Social Affairs, Human Rights and Gender. And she is visiting Brisbane at that time. So please keep an eye on your availability for Thursday night. And if you're not a member and are interested, do become a member for that, please. Next Tuesday, we've got a very interesting panel discussion on Afghanistan, power and resistance in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, women, minorities, and the diaspora. And we've got a panel of three people: Ariana Mahmoud, who's a lecturer at Southern Cross University, Dr. Mujid Abid, and Fahima Ahmadi. And they will be talking about different aspects of the life under Taliban rule and the life of the diaspora, coping with what is going on in Afghanistan. So that should be a very, very interesting talk. On the 5th of November, Tuesday the 5th of November, we have a joint panel discussion with the Women in International Security group on elevating intersectionality in international affairs. So that's advertised on our website. So please consider that. And obviously with an election going on in North America next month, we also have an event after the election with Dr. Andrew Phillips, who's a professor of international relations and strategy, on the outcome of the US election and what that means for Australia and the world. We thought that it was probably much more valuable having an event after the election rather than yet another event of what might happen with the events. Dr. Andrew Phillips has often been a commentator on the United States, and from 2018 to 2020, he served as ABC Brisbane's resident Trumpologist on evenings with Kelly Higgins Devine. So he is a wonderful and very, very informed commentator. So there are lots of events coming up, and so I would encourage you to get in and register for those. So thank you very much for coming along and sharing this event, and thank you once again, Dr. Faiza, for that very, very informative talk. Thank you.